The moment I heard my grandson laugh and say the old farm probably wasn't worth much anymore, something inside my chest folded in on itself like a weathered fence finally giving way after too many winters. It wasn't cruel laughter. That's the strange part. It was light, casual, the kind of laugh people use when they're just thinking out loud. But I heard every word. I was standing out by the fence line behind the barn, pretending to study a loose board I'd been meaning to fix for 3 years. The afternoon sun had begun its slow slide down toward the tree line, and the wind was pushing through the tall grass the way it always had, soft and steady, like the land breathing. From the porch I could hear them. My son Daniel, his wife, the kids. City voices. Quick voices. The rhythm of people who lived surrounded by traffic and schedules and glowing screens. They'd come out for the weekend. First time in nearly 4 years. I leaned on the fence post and listened. Well. I mean, my grandson Tyler said, his sneakers scraping the porch boards, look at this place. It's kind of cool in an old way, but it's basically falling apart. Someone chuckled. Property like this probably isn't worth much unless someone tears everything down and builds something new, he added. There was another laugh, softer this time. My son said something about taxes and upkeep. I kept my eyes on the fence. A nail stuck halfway out of the wood caught the sunlight, bright as a tiny blade. Funny how small sounds travel across open land. Their conversation drifted over the grass like smoke. Could probably sell the land though, Tyler continued. Developers buy stuff like this sometimes. Sell the land. The words floated out into the air like they belonged there. For a moment I forgot how old my hands had become. They were resting on the top rail of that fence, hands that had once swung hammers all day, hauled bales until sunset, pulled stubborn tractor engines apart and somehow convinced them to run again. Now they just rested. Quiet. I pushed the nail back into the wood with the heel of my palm and stayed there a little longer, letting the breeze carry the smell of soil and dry hay across the field. By the time I walked back toward the house, the conversation had moved on to something else. Football scores. Traffic on the interstate. A new shopping center outside the city. Tyler didn't notice me stepping onto the porch. None of them did. The porch boards creaked under my boots, that same old slow creak they'd made since the late 70s when I rebuilt the whole thing one summer after termites nearly turned it into dust. Finally Daniel looked up. "Hey Dad," he said with a smile that was warm but distracted. "You fixed that fence?" "Almost," I said. I gave Tyler a small nod. He smiled politely, the way young men do when they're standing near someone they know they're supposed to respect but don't really understand. I sat down in the old rocking chair near the corner of the porch. The chair complained under my weight the way it always had, letting out that familiar groan from the back joint. Nobody noticed. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the yard. The barn roof glowed deep orange, and the fields beyond it rolled out wide and quiet like they had something patient to say. They talked about city apartments. Mortgage rates. New restaurants. The farm sat all around us, silent as an old dog lying under the table. I smiled when someone looked at me. Nodded when it seemed right. And I kept hearing that sentence again in my mind. Probably isn't worth much. There's a particular kind of embarrassment that arrives late in a man's life. It doesn't shout. It just settles in quietly beside you. You start realizing that the things you gave your whole life to, the things that shaped your mornings, your muscles, your sense of purpose, have slowly become invisible to the world moving past them. I wasn't angry. That would have been easier. Instead there was just a strange kind of shrinking feeling, like the space my life had taken up in the world had quietly grown smaller without me noticing. Evening came the way it always did out there. Slow. Gentle. The wind cooled and the sky softened into those long country colors you never quite see the same way in the city. Daniel lit the old porch lantern, more out of nostalgia than necessity. We moved down to the long wooden table in the yard, the one I built out of leftover barn beams 30 years ago. The wood had gone gray with time. The benches were uneven. But it held us all the same. My daughter-in-law set down bowls of food she'd brought from town. The kids opened bottles of soda. Somewhere far off across the valley, a tractor engine hummed for a few minutes before going quiet. That familiar dusk silence began settling over the fields. If you've never lived near farmland, it's hard to explain that silence. It isn't empty. It's full of things resting. Grass. Soil. Old fences holding their shape against the years. Tyler leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs. "You ever think about selling this place, Grandpa?" he asked casually, wiping barbecue sauce from his fingers with a napkin. The table went quiet for a moment. Daniel gave him a look, but it wasn't harsh, more like the mild correction you give someone who said something slightly awkward. Tyler shrugged. "I mean, it's a lot of land." The wind brushed through the tall grass again. For a few seconds nobody said anything. I took a sip of water and set the glass down. "No," I said gently. "Never really thought about it." He nodded like that made sense. Like the answer had been a simple piece of information. And maybe it was. I looked out past the barn toward the wide stretch of field behind it. The sun was almost gone now, leaving behind that soft copper glow that sits on farmland right before the dark arrives. "Though I do remember the first year I bought it," I said. Nobody had asked for a story. But they looked up anyway. Tyler stopped fidgeting with his phone. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "The first year?" my daughter-in-law asked. I nodded. "The first winter especially." The porch lantern flickered once as the breeze passed through. "I was 27, I continued. And I was pretty sure I'd made the worst mistake of my life." Tyler chuckled softly. "You?" he said. I smiled. "Oh, absolutely." The night air carried the smell of soil and old timber across the yard. I rested my hands on the table, the wood smooth from decades of weather. "You see," I said quietly, "back then this place didn't look like much either. The fields were darker now. The barn stood like a quiet silhouette against the fading sky." And as I began telling them about that first year, the storms, the broken tractor, the long weeks when nothing seemed to grow the way it should, I noticed something change in the way they were listening. At first it was just politeness. But slowly, something else started settling over the table. Something quieter. Something heavier. And when Tyler finally looked out across the darkening field the way I had thousands of times before, I realized the part of the story that mattered most hadn't even begun yet. For a little while no one spoke. The crickets had started up in the grass, and the lantern light made a small circle on the old table where our hands rested. Beyond that circle the farm stretched out into darkness the way it always had, wide and patient. I leaned back slightly, feeling the bench shift under my weight. "You have to understand something about that first year," I said. "When I bought this land, it didn't look like it does now. Not even close." Tyler glanced toward the fields again. They were mostly shadows now, but if you knew where to look you could still see the faint lines where the rows ran straight across the land. "Back then," I continued, "most of that field was nothing but weeds and broken soil. The barn roof leaked in 6 different places. The well pump worked when it felt like it. And the house," I gave a soft laugh. "The house had a front door that didn't shut unless you lifted it and shoved your shoulder into it." Daniel smiled faintly. He'd heard parts of this before when he was a boy. But I'd never told it quite like this. "The first night I slept here," I said, "there was a windstorm. The kind that rattles everything loose on an old building. The windows kept knocking against the frames and I remember laying there thinking." I paused. What in the world have I done? Tyler let out a quiet breath through his nose. See, I didn't come from money, I said. I borrowed everything I could just to buy the land. Bank loan, small loan from my brother, and about 6 years of savings that disappeared the minute I signed the papers. The lantern flickered again. That first winter, I continued, I spent most days wondering if I'd lose it all before spring. The wind passed through the grass beyond the yard, making that slow brushing sound farmland makes when it moves as one big body. There was a storm in February, I said. Worst one that year. Snow piled halfway up the barn door. The roof over the tractor shed collapsed in the middle of the night. Tyler's eyes widened slightly. What did you do? He asked. I shrugged gently. Dug. He blinked. That's it? That's it. I smiled a little. Spent 2 days digging snow just to reach the tractor. Hands were so numb I could barely feel the shovel. But I got it out. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, remembering something. You fixed that roof alone, didn't you? He said. Mostly. Grandma helped. I nodded. She did. For a moment the table went quiet again. Your grandmother had been gone 12 years by then, but on that land she still showed up in every corner if you knew where to look. In the spring, I said softly, I planted my first crop. Tyler leaned forward. Corn, he guessed. No. I smiled. Beans. Why beans? Because they were cheaper if I failed. He laughed at that. But there was a softness in it now. First planting didn't take, I said. Too much rain that year. Half the rows washed out. The memory came back with the smell of wet soil and diesel fuel and long mornings where the sun hadn't yet warmed the ground. I remember standing out there one evening after the rain stopped, I continued quietly. Looking across the field and seeing whole patches where nothing had grown. I rested my fingers on the table. I thought about giving up. The crickets grew louder. Really? Tyler asked. Sure. I nodded toward the dark field. Starting something like this, it's lonely work. You put months into the ground before the ground ever answers you back. Daniel lowered his eyes slightly. He understood that part now in ways he hadn't when he was younger. But the next morning, I said, I went back out there anyway. Why? Tyler asked. I looked at him for a long second. Because quitting would have meant that land was right about me. He frowned slightly. What do you mean? I pointed gently toward the fields. Land tests you. Not with words. With time. With weather. With the quiet question of whether you're still going to show up tomorrow. The wind moved across the grass again. That summer, I continued, the second planting worked. Not perfectly. But enough. I could still see the rows in my mind, green shoots pushing up through soil that had been stubborn for months. It wasn't a big harvest, I said. Nobody would have called it impressive. But when I loaded those first sacks into the truck, I paused, feeling that old memory settle in my chest. I remember thinking I'd never been prouder of something in my life. Tyler stared out at the field again. You built all this after that? He asked. Bit by bit. I nodded toward the barn. Replaced that roof 3 years later. Built the porch the year your dad turned 10. Put in the new well pump after the drought in '88. Daniel chuckled quietly. And the fence I crashed the tractor into, he said. That too. The lantern light trembled slightly in the breeze. You see, I said slowly, nothing out here ever arrived all at once. Every board, every fence post, every good season, it came after a lot of small days where the work didn't look like much. The table had gone completely still now. No phones. No shifting chairs. Just listening. I folded my hands together. When people look at a place like this, I said gently, they see old wood. Old land. Maybe something outdated. Tyler's eyes moved slowly across the yard. But when I look at it, I continued, I see mornings before sunrise. Storms that almost took everything. Years when the ground gave just enough back to keep going. I smiled faintly. I see your grandmother hanging laundry behind the house while the wind tried to steal the sheets. I see your dad chasing chickens he was supposed to be feeding. I see summers where the grass got so tall it brushed against the porch steps. The silence deepened. None of those things have price tags, I said. Tyler swallowed quietly. The wind settled for a moment, leaving the farm wrapped in that deep rural stillness that only shows up after the sun has completely gone. So no, I said softly, I never thought about selling it. Nobody spoke. Not for a long while. Finally Tyler pushed his chair back slightly and stood. He walked a few steps away from the table, toward the edge of the yard where the tall grass began. He looked out across the field again. This time he didn't laugh. After a moment he said something very quiet. I didn't know. I didn't answer right away. I just watched the grass move in the darkness the way it had been moving for decades before any of us were here. You weren't supposed to, I said finally. He turned back toward me. What do you mean? I gave a small shrug. Most lives are built in ways that don't look important from the outside. The lantern hummed softly. And that's all right, I added. Tyler came back to the table slowly and sat down again. Daniel cleared his throat. Nobody rushed to change the subject. The farm sat around us the same way it always had, wide, quiet, and patient with whatever time brought next. After a while Tyler looked toward the barn again and said, almost to himself, I think I'd like to see the fields in the morning. I nodded once. They look different at sunrise. He smiled slightly. The kind of smile a young man gives when something in the world has shifted just a little under his feet. We sat there a while longer, letting the night settle over the land. And I remember thinking something that stayed with me ever since. A life spent building something slowly doesn't always leave behind monuments. Sometimes it just leaves behind stories. And sometimes those stories don't matter to anyone. Until someone finally takes the time to listen.